All right, a couple of things. First off, all of the position papers were graded. Good, I'm impressed. Must be better than I thought. I think people did a good job of focusing on and concentrating. There was good work with the citations that were used. Remember, whenever you use an association with a concept, make sure that you put the citation in, like Raven and Moss. Do it like that to make sure that you give credit for that, okay? All right, I'm gonna do it again, okay? So we won't have class on Thursday. Walker Spring Connect is on Thursday. It's between 1 and 4 in the afternoon. And I'm not gonna let you miss it if you want to go, okay? It's really, really helpful to your career, even if you're juniors, to get yourselves out there and meet with prospective individuals. How successful has it been? I have known several students that have gotten jobs right there. Very many times you will at least get interviews, which are just as good. And I just don't want to pass it up, or I don't want y'all to pass it up just for me. And once again, I'm doing the thing. So if you go there, whether you're going or not, I'll give you 3 points in the next test. I'm just doing this. But I think it's important. You know, I want to be able to support you. So there will be no class Thursday. And I have to go to Mississippi on next Tuesday. So there will be 2 recordings. My father passed away in November, and I am basically the one that's taking care of his estate right now. And it looks like we're going to sell his place. So I have to go and take care of that, and no one else can do it. So I won't be here Thursday, and I won't be here next Tuesday. You'll find 2 recordings for those classes. The Thursday recording will finish franchising. The one on Tuesday will talk about international trends. Okay. Okay. All right. So let's move right on. All right, so franchising is not necessarily an American invention, but it is something that Americans have really perfected. My old teacher, Dr. Reelan, at Southern Miss, who was such a great guy, and I'll never be as good as he was. Dr. Reelan said it's the perfect example if you have lots of money and no brains. He was not that. He was just a crazy guy. But I mean, basically the point is that franchising is one of those unique ways in which you're an individual and you have money to invest and you're willing and able to be trained. Franchising is a great way to be able to be successful, all right? Franchising has very unique elements that are different from any other way of running businesses. And franchising, because of those unique differences, are what make it so successful. I think it's something like 40,000 different franchises in the world today. It's kind of interesting. It's nice to see that there are a lot of franchises where you can get in with very little or no money. And then there are franchises that require $1 million to get in, such as McDonald's. And if you've got $1 million, why do you need to get in McDonald's? But that's the way it is, all right? Interestingly enough, Chick-fil-A, franchising fee is only $4,000. But, all right, It takes 2 years to go through their process for qualification, and you cannot make more than 50% of your income from something else. It's something that they believe in terms of their commitment. That's unique in the way that franchises are run. They're incredibly successful with their model, so much that franchises are considering talking about changing or going into that one. So let's talk about franchising. So what is a franchise? That's kind of what we need to talk about, or what is franchising in and of its nature. Well, basically, a franchise is 2 elements, all right? So the 2 elements are, the first thing is what's known as a franchisor. And that is, just think of that person as the upstream manufacturer. All right. The franchisor focuses all of their effort on a unique, specialized product field, including the services and all of the items that go into it. A franchisee is a second company that performs marketing functions. So a franchisee becomes the channel for the franchisor. They can do the advertising, they sell the product. They are unique and separate companies that use the identity of just one. In a franchise, in the situation, the franchisee, the main function is a deliberate loss of identity. The downstream franchisee in this situation deliberately gives up its identity in order to maintain the franchisors. The franchisor and the franchisee have two separate balance sheets. They have 2 separate income statements. They're in for businesses that are unique and, well, no, not necessarily unique and separate, but they are two unique business identities that in essence come together to exist as one unit. So they are not subsidiaries, they're unique companies. A franchisee convinces that you're buying from one manufacturer, where in essence you are buying from a separate company. So franchising started in bottling companies. If you notice, you will find many times Coca-Cola companies, Coca doesn't bottle all of their bottling at one place. They will franchise the right of their formulas to bottlers, and those bottlers in those locations will be the ones that ultimately bottle. All right. It's not post-World War II, but you can certainly see its growth, especially after that. And as I said before, it's just a unique, special way to grow, because for the franchisor and the franchisee, they have enormous advantages. So it originally came in history, just a little bit of blurb here, from farming equipment manufacturers. And it was also important for them because the franchises had unique, specific knowledge that it was important for them to share. And that the franchises gave the franchisees a way of doing business and the rights to sell their brand name. And ultimately, that's what made them valued. So, what are some of the things that a franchisor gives to the franchisee? They give them intellectual property rights. They give the right to the franchisee to use the franchisor's brand name as if they owned it themselves. So they have a common branding way that they work. The franchisor, because they focus on one single unique thing, has the ability to become consolidators or poolers of information and be able to take the incoming information from their franchisees and be able to predict and hopefully be ready when new trends develop, all right? They provide ongoing assistance as well. And hopefully we'll be able to give them a pathway of success. So having said those, there's actually two types of franchises. And you've seen these. If you go look at Mr. Tire, which is a couple of stores in Boone and around the area, they're what are known as a product and name franchise. All right, usually this is in a supplier-dealer relationship that can be called authorized franchise, franchising systems. What makes them unique in their ways is that they don't have a deliberate loss of identity. They can focus on a single industry, which means that they can house more than one unique product. And so Mr. Tire has Michelin, has Goodyear. I think they've got Pirelli, I'm not sure. But what that allows them to do is that they can have a wider selection. Product and name franchising is literally what it says. It allows you to advertise the products and names, the trade names themselves, and where the profit is made for the franchisors is to sell those products like tires to the franchisees, and that's how they make their money. If you look at automotive, you look at gas stations, QT, I believe, is one of those. Anybody ever been to a Buc-ee's? Those are the most insane things on the planet. Yeah. They're building one between Knoxville and Gatlinburg. It's going to have 262 gas pumps. You saw that? Yeah. They are the largest convenience store in the world, if you can believe that. And it all started because they wanted to clean restrooms. Okay. But that's an example is that they sell gas. But the last thing you look at when you go into a Buc-ee's is gas. You're trying to look at everything else. But by the very same token, of Mr. Tire, when you go into a Mr. Tire, they're authorized dealers and they service the equipment, the goods that they sell, but there is not that deliberate loss of identity. All right. And so bottlers, automotive industries, gas stations, modern Subaru is a good example as well. They tend to be more of a product and name franchise. And certainly you know them to be different, unique dealerships, all right? So product and name franchise, and then the business format franchise, which is really the all-encompassing one. When we think about franchising, that it's important for you to understand. Bless you. Franchising in the business format is more than just the way or selling products. It is an entire way of doing business. In a business format franchising, you are required to do certain kinds of accounting functions in a certain way, produce certain reports. So ultimately, all of those pieces of information are sent upstream to the franchisors. In a business format franchise, the deliberate loss of identity is real. If you go to the McDonald's and you go through the drive-through, when you get to the takeout window, if you notice, it will say operated by such and such a company with a phone number. That's the true corporation that runs that. But that McDonald's doesn't sell its own products. It sells exactly what McDonald's tells it to sell. It doesn't do anything special. It takes McDonald's menu. But what McDonald's gives to it is the enormous economies of scale that it takes when you have 4,000 other McDonald's franchises in the United States. The franchisors can pool their resources. They can be able to produce an enormous bulk. It means that the McDonald's, I wish they'd bring breakfast back all day. But the McDonald's anyway, even with all of that, it means that the franchisee has significant discounts from trying to buy those things as if they were going to go out into the real world and try to buy those things by themselves. So I was wrong. There's 732,000 business format franchises, from Great Clips to McDonald's. For a decade, Subway was the #1 business format franchise out there. And one of the reasons why is that their franchising fee was under $20,000. It was $18,000. It meant that even a mom and pop convenience store could be able to provide. All they had to do was have the right pieces of equipment to put it in there. So business format franchising has many, many advantages. It has had great success, especially over the last 50 to 100 years. And once again, I'm going to be conditional when I talk about it, because I'll also talk about when they're not so good, all right? There is no, in terms of the way the channel and the influences go, because there is a much greater need for commitment and trust, but that commitment and trust is tied much closer to legal legitimate power, because the contracts are what spell out everything you're supposed to do, all right? The gray area happens because you simply have to get along to be able to succeed. So let's talk about what the benefits are. So I got $1 million and I want to go. The first thing that I might have to do, if I were to try to put a McDonald's here in Boone, I would have to look for a piece of property. Well, the advantage with a franchisee is that many of the franchisors do that for you. McDonald's is, I think, the 3rd largest owner of land in the United States, second being Walmart, and #1 being the US government. And the reason why is that every McDonald's franchise, the building is owned by the franchisor, but the land is owned by the franchisee, okay? Why? Anybody got an idea how much the land where McDonald's sits here is worth right now in Boone? Want to guess? It's about $1.5 million, that little piece of property. Do you know the Wendy's? You know how much that's worth? Want to guess? $4 million. Yes, I read somewhere and I was looking at it that little Wendy's is like one of the #1 producer in Western Carolina in terms of the number of orders and stuff like that. Yeah, it's just insane. So the thing, or the advantage of a McDonald's coming in and buying the land for you is quite simply, they don't have to make those choices. And so that first initial system of location, generally it varies between the franchisors, but generally the franchisor will choose the land. They'll do like a market study and all like that. They'll check the efficiencies. Kind of some unique things like enterprise rent-a-car is generally not in airports, Enterprise Rent-A-Car was built as a franchise to be out in the suburbs because Enterprise, their model was built around having consumers rent the cars greater than 3 or more days, because that was the car that you would use when your other car was in the shop. All right. So that would be another kind of those decisions that Enterprise or a franchisor would make. So that's the first thing that the franchisee gets. The next is they get the business model. So the business model teaches the franchisor, the person with the cash in their hand, what is the most efficient way that they can do their work. They have a series of reports that they have to fill out every week. The reports every week contain all sorts of tidbits of information that when it's fed upstream, they can anticipate where problems are occurring and can tip the franchisee how to correct problems before they become big ones. They continuously coach, they support, they consolidate all of the legal and financial issues, and they police the quality of all of the goods that the franchisee is using. And that's the other advantage for the franchisor, because it's knowing that the quality will always be there. One of the stupidest things that Subway did, they did this 4 years ago. Subway had a policy of delivering fresh fruit every day. And that's one of the reasons you cannot skimp on quality. And then they were having issues with the franchise, and they wanted to make it to like 1 every 3 days. And that really, really trashed them out. Okay. There's some things that you can't substitute, but in a good, efficient franchise, the ability to police those things can be extremely important. All right. The last thing that you have is you have a brand name. I open a McDonald's anywhere, and I immediately have a customer base. Doesn't matter, especially breakfast. All right. The customer base is going to be predictable. You know it'll always be there. Chick-fil-A is another example. There are franchises by their very nature that they bring consumers with them. And these are the benefits to the franchisee. Spam. Okay. I ate that yesterday. Okay, so franchising. Yes, yeah, Fred.
Regarding the franchise, so like say that Wendy's property,
Yes,
so the franchisee owns it,
yes.
but franchisor owns like the building.
The franchisor will own the property itself,
Okay,
and the franchisee builds the building on the property.
okay,
All right. If you look at it, it's what they call the deadly embrace. All right. You can't separate the two. You can't separate the building from the property. It's one of those things, you know, that in the way it works out, it means that you've got to find a way of working together. But it also means that even though all of the legal stuff and the contracts are all spelled out, that there's still a lot of, it is, what's the words I want to use? There is no solution better than finding a way of working things out if things go wrong. That's kind of the way it happens, all right?
so if I brought in $20,000 to like,
Right.
I wanted to sell out, can you already just stuck there, but just kind of replace it?
It depends on the contracts, which is one of the important things, and we'll talk about that with contracts. It all depends on whether or not in the contract it says, usually the way it would happen is, let's say you had $20,000. They may have just a drop dead clause in it which says that, no, you can go away. I mean, with the Subway, there's so many franchises with Subway, it may not matter. You may have the right to sell your franchise to another person, all right? But the franchisor would have what's called right of first refusal. So if they didn't like the individual that you were selling to, they would say, no, you can't do that. And how would they, the individual who would like take your business over would have to apply almost in the same way that you did. So they have to have income statements, balance sheets, your income levels over the last 5 years. You need to be able to qualify all of those things at the same time. But yes, you could get out. Franchise contracts are usually 15 years in length. And then they're like every year or so. But, they tend to be just continuous, other than, of course, if you're in, dire straits. So, yeah, you can get out. So what are the benefits of a franchisor? I've always said that in this town, one of the great places that could really spread as a franchise is the Comeback Shack. They've got one in Myrtle Beach now, but if they ever wanted to franchise it, I've always thought it's a perfect model to be able to go somewhere else, especially in, oh gosh, what's the word I want to use? Like tourist towns, all right? So they've got one in Myrtle Beach. They've got one here. I love the fact that you can roll that door open and, just blows through the place. Of course, I haven't been that way in a while. But if you have a great idea, and an idea that unfortunately sometimes can be copied, what for a franchisor, the big thing that it can do is it can spread that idea. Instead of me constantly hiring and training managers for new outlets, I can simply have someone do those things for me. And so if I were a Comeback Shack and I wanted to put 10 places out there, I'd do a franchise incorporation, and I bet you I'd have 10 right away. So that would be the first thing that you could do. The next thing, or the advantage for the franchisor, is that you get connections to the locals in those areas as well. And the franchisees may have some kind of special knowledge or ideas that the franchisors wouldn't have thought about. So the fish sandwich came from Louisiana. The fish sandwich came from during the 40 days of Lent that traditionally you wouldn't eat meat on Friday. So you would eat fish. And a franchisee decided to make a fish sandwich. McDonald's got the idea, and that's why we have the fish sandwich. It all came from something local. For the franchisor, it gives you outlets for new personnel inside your office. In those places out there are young people who are learning your business, who have ideas and goals, and they want to grow. Maybe they don't want to stay in that local franchise. Maybe they want to move up to corporate. And so it becomes a great place to go out and find new talent. So just to give you an idea, the guy at McDonald's who came up with the coffee thing actually was a hamburger flipper at Hamburger Union. He started as somebody who worked the counter. He turned into the assistant manager, night manager, became a manager, owned the franchises, moved up to corporate, and then became CEO of McDonald's from 2007 to 2012. That can happen. It's real. Dave Thomas. Anybody know that name? So, way back when, there was a guy by the name of Duncan Hines, all right? So Duncan Hines, in 1930, was a traveling salesman who went all across the United States with his wife. And because there was no such things as franchises or quality, he kept in his little notebook all of the best places to eat, all of the best places to go stay at hotels. And he was at an office party in the 40s, and they looked at all the work he and his wife did, and they said, "You got to publish this." So it became the Duncan Hines list, and it became so thought of with quality. This is what Duncan Hines came from. So Duncan Hines in the 50s goes to this little place in Kentucky, and there's this guy there who is making fried chicken, wearing this funny suit. And he starts talking about this chicken in Kentucky made by this old guy and says it's the best chicken he's ever eaten. All right. The franchise becomes Kentucky Fried Chicken. It's Colonel Sanders. And there's a young guy that comes to work for him when he's 14 years old. And he grows in and he becomes the owner of the franchise. And he said every important lesson he learned was from Colonel Sanders. And the number one for him was always Colonel Sanders was the quality of the ingredients. Nothing mattered else. That guy was Dave Thomas, and Dave Thomas founded Wendy's. All right. So this is where all the connections kind of come in together. And this is the advantages for the franchisors. It's an outlet for all of that talent. Not only that, but for the franchisors, they may have people who want to run a franchise. And what a great way for them to be able to get into it, understand the entire corporate business, and then be able to take that and pass it down. So it's a win-win incentive. You know, it gives you better profits. The better you do, the better you perform. The psychological factors, you have these conduits to go in and out, and it helps to keep existing managers as well. You don't lose talent in the franchise situation, all right? Or let's just say not as readily. So these are the benefits to the franchisors. Now, here I said everything's so wonderful, and then sometimes it's not, okay? There are some things where you don't franchise. And Starbucks, with all of the 12 million stores that they have in existence in humanity across the universe, only in airports and selected locations and in other countries where they can't own them wholly, do they actually have any franchises at all right? So franchising doesn't deal with many times the misdirected effort that you have between two corporations, because even when there's a commonality between them, there are always mixed messages that can happen, all right? So it's not the only option. It is easier to manage the quality of a store if everybody is owned by a single corporate entity. And so Apple can argue effectively that if you want the best of their products, go to an Apple store. I don't totally agree with that, but that's the kind of things that you can argue with a franchise, or excuse me, if you own everything, the channels all the way through the system. So let us move on. They're just talking about some things. So there's some other things to think of when you're coming into a franchise environment, and here are a few of them. The first thing you've got to think about is the money. So the first thing you need to think about is how do you go about deciding what are your entry fees, okay? So generally you have what is called a franchise fee, which is a buy-in. And then depending on the type of franchise it is, it also will probably require some kind of construction in one way or another, all right? And so those are the first fees you have to think about. And then you also think about whether or not you'll have royalty. We're gonna touch this up a little bit later. The next is the real estate. Who owns the lease? And this is why McDonald's owns their leases, because quite honestly, it's simpler. It's simpler on the franchisee. It's simpler on the franchisor. There's always the concern that if you own both of those, you'll drop out and you'll make your own place. So it's a little smaller idea. There's a franchise in Mississippi called Ward's, and they make chili burgers that are just awesome. And they had one store in Columbia where I used to live, and the guy owned the store and he owned the land, and he got in an argument with the guy, and he no longer became Ward's, and he became what was called the Deck, and now he outsells the Ward's in Columbia. So those are the kinds of things that if you don't buy the lease, those are the things that could happen. The next thing that you've got to do is you got to have in writing, how do you end the relationship? There has to be a clearly defined way in which you spell out what is the ways that your relationship is terminated. So let's go in a little bit more and talk about the fees and costs. So the first fee you have is what's called the hostage cost, the initial fee to get into the franchise. Those systems that especially are welcoming people into the franchise, such as Subway, have low franchise fees, $18,000. That is your initial hostage cost. You never get it back. The sunk costs have to do with specialized decor and fixtures and equipment and necessities. So while I talk about the Subways being a relatively inexpensive franchise fee, you are also required to have a certain amount of area in your particular building and have a certain format set up in that building and have a certain level of quality in that same areas as well. And so those are the sunk costs. Those are costs that are never returned. Those are the franchisee fees that they have to. For the franchisor, the real fees that you have are the royalties on the sales. Royalties are good things, but royalties are expensive. So Entree Computer Store, when there were computer stores in Lafayette, they had a 9% royalty on sales, which meant that before you paid one bill, if you sold $100,000, you sent $9,000 to the franchisor first, and then you can pay everybody else, all right? But the royalties do well because you do well when your franchisee does well, and so there's a natural kind of reluctance not to be such a jerk, okay? So a little bit more. How do you go about, or what are some of the ways in which the payment systems work? Well, you can have the initial high cost and then low royalties. And even though you say a contract is a contract, of course, people will try to renegotiate. A high initial cost means that you recover some of the benefit back. Low cost with high royalties, this is what Subway does, shows you're not just simply trying to take the money and run. It's easier to recruit franchises, especially in difficult situations, all right? But the most typical pattern, truthfully, is low cost and low royalties. That there is this need to show generosity as a franchise, that you're not just simply there to milk the franchisees dry. And the sunk costs are generally enough to get them from trying to renegotiate, okay? So it shows at least you're doing your best to help the franchisee to achieve some kind of success. So you find this to be the more modern model too, because once again, you're trying to find a way to have influence and to be able to avoid the conflicts, all right? And one of those ways is to be perceived as being fair. We talked about fairness. Well, fairness, especially when it comes to cost and royalties, means that you're both distributively being fair, that when the distribution comes out, you're being fair, and that it also means you're being treated fair on a day-to-day basis. So this is the reason why. So I've talked about the reasons why the franchisee or its franchisor owns the lease, but this is what happens if the franchisee does. You get more management from the franchisor required because they have to approve everything. And just think of the economies of scale. So if I come in and I'm the single corporation that runs McDonald's here in Boone, and I say, I want to buy $1.5 million of property, and they look at your books and they say, you're not making enough money. That's the first thing that happened. But if McDonald's corporate walks in and says, we're $500 million, we make $500 million every year, we want to buy land, they're going to start getting their pencils sharpened because they want you. And so it's more difficult for the franchisee to do it. When the franchisor owns the lease, it's easier to get the property. It relieves the pressure from the franchisee. The sunk costs aren't easier. But the truth is, it's easier to kick you out. So as I said, the franchisee in Columbia owned the property and the building where Ward stood. And when they got into disputes, he simply threw them out and he started his own business. And Ward's had already trained him how to make good food. And that's why they've got 3 locations in Columbia. The first statement is the biggest. As you're talking about, Freddie, is replacing franchisees are costly. The franchisee has enormous leverage to negotiate because of all the investment that they've both in. They're usually spelled out in contracts, ways or things you're supposed to do, and those can be expensive. Now, there's one other thing I didn't say about the right of first refusal. The right of first refusal also means that the franchisor can actually simply buy it themselves and run it outright and turn it into what's called a company store. And so if Freddie's trying to sell his, he's got this person lined up, even if everything that they've got looks good, the franchisors can say, no thanks, we're going to turn that into a company store, and they have the right to first refusal. That's one of the things that you try to make sure of when you're doing the contracting the way that is. So just some basic things here. This isn't going to be big, especially when it comes to studying. Most contracts are extremely similar. And the reason why most contracts are extremely similar is that whole thing about fairness, okay? The contracts need to be similar because you don't want to show to any of your franchisees that one or other has an unfair advantage. Because hopefully what you're trying to avoid is some of the issues that you would have if you were to have other stores that were competing against each other. You don't want intra-competition to be going on. Usually they're written for 15 years at a time and they change very little. You may raise fees when they're better established, that might be part of it. But you don't want to compromise. You want to avoid the legal fees of customizing the contracts because it raises the price quite simply. So most contracts are similar to avoid any improprieties or any perception of being unfair. They're written for a long time and change very little. And above all things, once again, we're going back to fairness. They will avoid claims of discrimination. You want those contracts to be the same. Now, you can make special alterations given unique circumstances. I mean, of course, being up here in Boone, we have a different environmental situation. If they were on the Gulf Coast, you would probably have some stipulations about flood insurance and those kind of things. But in the nuts and bolts heart of it, they're going to be similar because you don't want to deal with the issues. Neither side does. So I talked about this and I've talked about it again. What kind of enforcement do you really want? The most enforcement you want is self-enforcement. You want both sides to be willing to stay and narrow the course, because you don't want them going off in each situation. And that's really what the franchise environment is built around. There is an incentive to treat people fairly, because you want the proper information to be exchanged. You're more likely to have clientele that are fully engaged and trusting you. And contracts are often used as guidelines. So it means that if you abuse something in the contract, it doesn't mean that you're going to be cut out. It just means that the franchisors have to weigh each kind of infraction. You want to maintain the relationships because it's simply built in that you get along. All right. Contracts, the best ones, make you enforce yourself rather than having the franchisor enforce you. And what it hopefully does is it helps you to do things like stop some other supplier, or let's say some franchisee, from going to buy from someone else because he thinks it's cheaper. You don't have the franchisor cheating in one way or another, especially with like health inspections or those kind of things. You want there to be a willing bindedness that basically means success happens when you all stay the same. All right. So the last thing I want to end with today is, let's see, wait a minute, is that the last one I want to do? No, tell you what, let's go ahead and end there, because we were just finishing up. And this was 8.2, where we talked about the basic structures of franchises. So Thursday, I'll have this posted where we'll talk about store strategies, singular and plural, and then the future trends in franchising. Okay. All right, we're done for today. Have a good week. I will not be back until Thursday week, as I said. So take care. Have a good one. Good luck if you go to the job fair.